Our hearts were shattered. Our son, Stephen, had taken his own life. The weight of grief settled heavily upon us, but what made the sorrow even harder to bear were the words we heard next. Kate, our daughter, told us the devastating news, but it wasn't just the tragedy that cut us deep. She blamed us. She said that the special treatment we gave Stephen, the very thing we thought was necessary for him to thrive, was the reason he was gone. According to Kate, we had pushed him to the edge, and now, we had to face the consequences of our mistakes. She told us that we failed as parents, and now, she might cut contact with us, too. She said she didn't want to be connected to people like us. James stood by her side. He, too, believed that we had failed our son. He thought we should at least admit our mistake, that maybe if we had done things differently, things would have turned out differently. The words stung, but we couldn't escape them. We couldn't deny that a part of us still questioned what we might have done wrong. Kate packed her bags and left, her anger in every step she took. Before she walked out the door, she made it clear, if we wanted any relationship with her, we had to acknowledge what we had done, admit our wrongs, and learn from it. But we couldn't. We couldn't admit to something we didn't believe. In our hearts, we knew we had tried everything we could to help Stephen. He had refused all the help we offered, and his bitterness, his rejection of the world, had pushed him further away. We had been patient, loving, and caring. We had tried to let him see that he wasn't different, that there was nothing wrong with needing help. We had done everything we thought was right. But what if we were wrong? What if Stephen's death was a result of our own blindness, our failure to see his pain, the hurt he carried inside himself? Was it really society's fault for judging him for being different? Or was it us? Could we have been the ones to save him, had we done something more? Tomorrow would have been Stephen's 21st birthday. It had been almost a year since he was gone, and yet it still felt like just yesterday that we were planning his future, hopeful and optimistic. Instead, we were left with this unbearable void, this silence that screamed louder than anything else. We had 3 children, James, Kate, and Stephen, and we had always done our best to be good parents. But the weight of that question still lingered. Could we have saved Stephen? Or had we failed him in the end? When Stephen was 6, he was diagnosed with autism. We did everything in our power to support him, to help him fit into a world that often felt alien to him. We sought out specialists, resources, and guidance. But no matter what we did, Stephen resisted. He didn't want help. He didn't want to be different, even though that was exactly what he was. He said he didn't want to be treated like a subhuman. He demanded that we stop helping him, that we stop seeing him as anything but normal. We tried, time and time again, to reassure him that he wasn't less than anyone else, that he had strengths and abilities that deserved to be recognized. But Stephen couldn't see it. He refused to accept it. As he got older, Stephen became more and more withdrawn. He distanced himself from everyone around him, including us. He didn't want anyone to know about his condition, didn't want to be seen as the special child. When he was 12, he asked us if he could change schools, but he demanded that no one be told about his autism. We said no. We thought it was essential for him to be honest, for him to accept who he was, and for others to understand what he needed. But we never anticipated how deeply this would hurt him, how much it would add to the loneliness he already felt. By the time Stephen was 14, the darkness had crept in. He became depressed, suicidal, and refused to seek treatment. He wouldn't take medication. He wouldn't go to therapy. Even when we told him that it had nothing to do with his autism, he couldn't see it. All he saw was the special treatment, the pity, and the constant reminder that he wasn't like everyone else. He believed that if only he could escape it all, if only he could live a life where he wasn't seen as different, then he could be happy. But we didn't understand. We didn't know how deep his pain really was. At 15, Stephen tried to end it all. He tried to hang himself. It was a miracle that he survived, but the scars from that attempt never fully healed. After that, he proposed a compromise. If we let him go to a school where no one knew about his autism, if we stopped treating him differently, he would agree to treatment. He would accept help. Some of his teachers, even a few of his friends, urged us to let him do it. They said it was the only way. But we couldn't. We couldn't bear the thought of him going through life without the support he needed. So, we stood firm, but in doing so, we pushed him further away. When he turned 18, Stephen graduated high school, moved away to attend his dream university, and severed all contact with us. He left an angry letter behind, blaming us for ruining his life. He said we were the reason for his depression, his struggles. He said we made him feel like a crazy, stupid, awkward person. He said he hated us with all his heart. We tried to reach out. We called, we sent letters, we emailed. But Stephen refused to respond. The last time we saw him was when we visited his university. He wouldn't even speak to us, and when we pressed him, he threatened to file a restraining order. We left immediately. That was the last time we saw our son. When Stephen was accepted into his dream university, the University of Oxford, we were blindsided. He had applied without telling us, and we only found out when he left us a letter, an angry, venomous letter. It was filled with resentment, blaming us for ruining 12 years of his life. In his words, we were the reason for his pain, the reason he had suffered all these years. He cut all contact with us, leaving us in the dark, but continued to speak with James and Kate. He blocked us everywhere. We tried everything to reach him, different numbers, emails, letters, but he refused to respond. From what we heard through his siblings, Stephen was thriving academically. He had chosen to study chemistry and biology, subjects he had always been passionate about. He'd talked about pursuing a PhD, about becoming a pharmacologist or organic chemist. We were proud of him, though, deep down, we worried it would be too much. But he had made friends, he seemed to be doing well. Still, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that we were losing him in ways we couldn't understand. Then came our visit to his university, last November. We thought, maybe, just maybe, if we saw him face to face, we could begin to heal. But it was nothing like we hoped. Stephen wouldn't speak to us. He was cold, distant. He threatened us with a restraining order if we didn't leave. That moment, our last attempt to connect with him, ended with more silence than ever. A month later, he was gone. He overdosed on medication. He succeeded where he had failed before. Kate couldn't contain her anger. She blamed us for his death, pointing to the countless times Stephen told us how much he didn't want to be treated differently, how much he just wanted to be normal. But we didn't listen. We never listened. The guilt consumed her. She told us that we killed her brother. With that, she cut contact with us too. Just like that. The person we thought would stay by our side was now gone, just like Stephen. James, too, began to pull away. He still spoke to us, but less and less. In a matter of months, we had lost nearly all of our children. The house that once buzzed with life now echoed with a deafening silence. We tried to distract ourselves, but the pain was always there. With Stephen's birthday just around the corner, the void felt even more suffocating. He had always disliked celebrating his birthday, but now, it only reminded us of what we had lost, of the distance between us and the children we once had. We had no way of reaching Kate anymore. She stopped talking to us about 10 months ago. It had been just over a month since Stephen's suicide when she completely cut ties. At that point, Stephen hadn't spoken to us for over a year. He had left for university, shut us out, blocked us on everything. When we visited him, he didn't even acknowledge us. Kate was hurting. She blamed us for his death, and we couldn't find a way to convince her otherwise. James, despite everything, still spoke to her, but he refused to get involved. He believed she didn't have to speak to us if she didn't want to. He also thought Stephen had ended his life because of us, even if that didn't make sense. We couldn't reach Kate. We tried social media, tried visiting her, but she wasn't home. We had known where she lived, but even that was slipping away. Then, we learned that Kate had moved to New York City in September. She had enrolled in a PhD program at a university there, and we didn't even know where she was living anymore. Our daughter, whom we thought we could still reach, was gone. What could we do to make her talk to us again? Amid all this, my husband's drinking problem had spiraled out of control. It had been over 2 years now, and it was getting worse. He drank vodka, mostly, sometimes wine, and on weekdays, he'd knock back 2 to 5 shots by noon. On weekends, it was even worse, sometimes an entire bottle. When he drank, he became someone else. Angry, volatile. He screamed, yelled, but never physically hurt anyone. Still, the emotional toll was unbearable. I barely spent any real time with him. He was always drunk. He would start drinking as soon as he got home from work, and weekends weren't any better. At first, his drinking had been under control, with my help. We had managed to keep it in check. But no matter how hard we tried, it always got worse again. The anger, the bitterness, it was like a cycle we couldn't break. The tipping point came when Stephen applied to university without us knowing and shut us out completely. That was when my husband started drinking more heavily. Before that, he'd only had a drink for special occasions, holidays, parties, date nights. But once Stephen was gone, the alcohol became his escape. I felt like I was losing him. Like he was slipping away in the haze of vodka and wine, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. When his drinking was at its worst, it was like the man I once knew didn't exist anymore. What could I do to end this, to save him from the grip of alcohol before it took everything from us too? It all started when my husband became the legal guardian of his niece. Despite my worries, he insisted that he could handle it all, that he would take care of everything. We'd been together for 15 years, and a year ago, we finally got married. I had a successful career in a demanding field, physically and mentally exhausting, with travel that took me far from home. We had talked about starting a family, so when I found out I was pregnant, I made the choice to leave my job and become a stay-at-home mom. But life didn't go as planned. I miscarried. Then, his sister passed away. Everything came to a halt. In the meantime, I picked up a part-time job in a related field, one that allowed me to work remotely. I needed something to do, something to keep my mind from slipping into the chaos. My sister-in-law had been a nurse, but when she died, she quit her job to care for her daughter full-time. Her daughter, my niece, has nonverbal autism, along with a series of developmental disorders, like dyslexia, and severe sensory issues. My husband said he was doing most of the work. But he wasn't. Not really. Since I was working part-time from home, most of the responsibility fell to me. She would get angry often. Her meltdowns became a regular part of our lives. And food? She was picky, so picky. The smallest change in texture, the slightest variation in taste, and she would lose control. I made dinner one evening, but she wouldn't eat. Instead, she threw the plate at my feet, and I felt the sting of the glass shattering beneath me. Blood! I looked down, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I called my husband. I told him to come home, that I needed him, but he couldn't. He couldn't even leave his meeting. Frustration boiled over. I went up to our room and texted him, telling him I was done, that I couldn't handle it anymore. When he came home hours later, she was still crying, her sobs echoing through the house. He was furious, his anger palpable. He called me heartless. Irresponsible. I told him that I had had enough of both of their behavior, of the lack of appreciation, and I told him I was leaving. I was going to my mom's, and I wouldn't be back until New Year's. He begged me to stay, but I left anyway. Every day, he called me, asking me to come back. And eventually, I did. When I came home, he told me that my actions had forced him to use up all his available leave to stay home with her. He said he was glad I was back. I wasn't ready to be the person who pretended things were okay, though. I had already contacted my old company, and they had offered me my job back. It started next Monday. In an office. With travel. A lot of travel. The problem? He couldn't stay home anymore. He'd already used all his leave, and he couldn't afford a full-time caregiver. He was stuck. But I reminded him. He promised to take care of everything when he became her guardian. This was his problem now, not mine. He couldn't ask me to put my life on hold for something he had taken on without consulting me. My family, of course, supported me. But his family? They thought I was being selfish. I wish I could tell you things improved. But they didn't. My husband interviewed several caretakers for my niece. He found one who seemed capable and experienced. She was hired for 5 weekdays, 9 hours each day. But then, one day, she couldn't make it because of an emergency. My husband had an important meeting, and he asked me to take over for the day. I refused. He didn't take kindly to that. In fact, he took my car keys while I was getting ready, leaving before I even noticed. I couldn't believe it. This was exactly the kind of behavior my narcissistic, gaslighting father used to do. I was furious. I told my husband that if he didn't return my keys within an hour, I would call CPS. And once they arrived, I would call a cab and go to work. He came back in a rush, and we fought. I told him that if he ever did anything like that again, I would walk away and never come back. He apologized, saying he was just desperate. Then, 2 weeks ago, things reached their breaking point. I was preparing for a work trip, but I couldn't find my passport. I'm an organized person. I knew I hadn't misplaced it. After calling the non-emergency helpline, they ransacked the house and eventually found it, hidden in his gym bag. It was illegal to take someone's passport, and when they asked me if I wanted to press charges, I said no. But that led to another fight. He told me that I needed to stay home that weekend because of a social welfare visit. He knew I wouldn't stay if he asked, but he didn't ask. Instead, he demanded. I was done. I kicked both him and his niece out of my house. And I told him if he came near me again, I'd call the police. This house was mine. It was a premarital asset, thank God. I told him I was filing for divorce. The welfare visit didn't go well either. When the social worker arrived, neither of them were home, and she was aware of the recent incident with my passport. She wasn't impressed with their behavior. 2 days ago, my husband came by, saying he had moved in with his parents. They lived in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment that didn't meet welfare requirements. He begged me for another chance, asking if I would let him and his niece stay with me until they figured things out, or else she'd have to go into state care. He told me he couldn't afford rent and begged me to help. But I told him I could never forgive him for what he'd done. I reminded him that he knew about my past with my father. He knew how painful it was for me to be manipulated and controlled, yet he still chose to do the same thing. He suggested they move in and we could work things out through couples counseling. But I told him that I could never trust him again. And so, I told him it was over. I told him to leave. That I never wanted to see either of them again. I still don't know if I'm making the right decision, but I know one thing, I can't go back to that. I'm still not sure when I'll start the divorce proceedings, but I will. For now, I'm taking a break. The last few weeks have been emotionally draining. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories like this.